Hello and welcome to Stoicism, Philosophy as a Way of Life. My name is Donald Robertson and today's guest is Armand D'Angour, Professor of Classics at Oxford University. He's the translator of How to Innovate, an ancient guide to creative thinking, which I think is his most recent book. But the book that we're really going to be focusing on today is called Socrates in Love, the Making of a Philosopher, which he's written among a number of other works. So, first of all, welcome to the podcast, Armand. How are you? And where are you speaking to us from?
From London today, from my home.
I'm here in Montreal. So, let's dive right in with the relevance of Socrates. Why are we talking about Socrates? Why do you think he's relevant and important today? And why did you choose to write about him?
Briefly, I think it's something that everybody's aware of, that Socrates, life and death, dying by drinking the hemlock, being put to death by Athens. I think that's something everybody knows about. They've heard about Socrates, not just the footballer, Socrates the philosopher, as the perhaps fundamental figure in Western philosophy, and a lot of people hear about the Socratic method. So, very important figure in the history of philosophy, about which people know a few factoids, perhaps, such as those that I've mentioned. Some might know that he had a shrewish wife called Xantippe. But what they don't know is really what this person was like and how he became this founding philosopher, this founding figure in Western philosophy. And I just think that's very interesting. We have a lot more information about him than most people know.
Yes.
And the book that I wrote actually adduces much more information, I think, than most people care to have thought about. And that means the academic world.
True. And that's surprising because people have been writing about him for 2,500 years. Yeah. And yeah, I said to you earlier before we came on that if I crack open a book about a topic like Socrates, I kind of think, oh, is it going to be all the same old, same old? And your book isn't. So, by the way, I would recommend that everybody goes out and reads it because it's very accessible and it's quite an original work in many regards. So, and the other thing I would mention about it is you're talking about Socrates' life. Socrates' life and his thought, his philosophy, his inner and outer life are inseparably connected, do you think?
Yes, I do. I think that all of our thinking emerges from who we are, where we're situated in our own lives, in our cultural lives, in our history. And Socrates, of course, was no different. There is a philosophical background, some of which he takes on, some of which he rebels against. The background which he would have inherited in the early 5th century would have been the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, some of whom he knew in person, one
Mm-hmm.
of whom the sources tell us he was the beloved boy of. This is a man called Archelaus, quite well
Mm-hmm.
known in his time. Nobody has taken any of that seriously, and there's absolutely no reason not to take it seriously.
Yeah.
Of course, one might feel a bit offended by the idea that in his youth Socrates had a sexual relationship with a much older man.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, that was something that was relatively commonplace to a certain class of young man in his day.
Mm-hmm.
And that already tells us something that goes against the standard views of Socrates, which is that he came from a terribly poor background.
Yeah.
Actually, if he did have an older lover who was quite a well known figure in Athens, and indeed was in the circle of the leading citizen of Athens, Pericles,
Mm-hmm.
then Socrates can't have been just some poor youth as he's made out to be. And there's a lot of other evidence that he wasn't. So
Mm-hmm.
that's already a beginning of reconstructing, revising what people think they know about this man.
Yeah. Who was this guy, and what do we and don't we know about him? Well, I've got let's step back a moment because you're kind of touching on the first of many controversies of today, which is, as you said, on the one hand, it's puzzling that people don't know more about the most famous philosopher in history. Everyone knows his name, but they can tell you that he drank hemlock, but not necessarily that much more. In the ancient world, in antiquity, people would be able to tell you lots of stories about Socrates. The Apology was very widely read, and people would probably know lots of anecdotes about him. Um, so his life would have been more familiar in a sense. But now we have the first of many problems, the Socratic problem, which is what are we supposed to make of the textual evidence that we have? So we have Plato's dialogues, a lot of stuff, but there are some annoying problems interpreting the biographical content. And then we have Xenophon's dialogues, which people are less well known, but we have a lot of them. And they paint a slightly different picture of Socrates. And then to confound the picture even more, most people probably won't know that we have Aristophanes' portrayal of Socrates in the clouds, which bears very little resemblance to the character that Plato portrays. And then we have a bunch of other sources as well. So it's kind of a dog's breakfast of historical evidence, which you made your way through and constructed a story of. What are we supposed to make of all of this stuff? Like, how reliable is it? And for instance, we should say Plato's dialogues. How literally can we take the historical content in them?
I think we can't take a lot of them very literally. So Plato's 28 or so dialogues in which he makes Socrates the mouthpiece for his own ideas are obviously constructions. These are not the ipsissima verba, the actual words that Socrates would have used as they are presented by Plato. They may, to some degree, represent his words and his ideas. There's a general view that some of the so-called earlier dialogues are more faithful to what Socrates actually said and thought. The later dialogues are essentially Plato's own ideas and doctrines dressed up as things that were thought of and said by Socrates. I think that's broadly speaking true, but it means that we can't take Plato's dialogues as a whole and say they give us a biographical picture of Socrates. And also, the fact is that Plato was very concerned to present Socrates as someone who was innocent of the charges for which he was executed. So he has a certain partisanship in the way he wants to present Socrates. For example, he doesn't want the world to think of Socrates as someone who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, even though in one of the very earliest dialogues of the Apology, he has Socrates saying in his own defense, I became poor because I was following the instructions of the god Apollo to be a philosopher. So if he became poor, then it means he wasn't poor at one stage. And that kind of thing slips out. And I think this is the fact that we have to track down in Plato. And he and Xenophon probably didn't know Socrates until Socrates was around 60.
Right.
So we also have to ask ourselves, what don't they know? So one, what do they want to show? What do they suppress? And what don't they know? And then you get other sources which people have not taken seriously because they're not as coherent, they're not as full, they're not as well preserved as the dialogues of Plato and the treatises of Xenophon.
Well, here's another question for you. To what extent does it matter? Like, can we distinguish between... So on the one, I guess we have to distinguish between the real Socrates and then the literary construct of Socrates that comes down to us in the textual tradition. And suppose it turned out the portrayal of Socrates that we get bears very little resemblance to the real historical figure. I mean, might there still be some value in exploring and elaborating the literary construct? I mean, if this is semi-fictional, like, do we need to get to the historical truth, or is it worth simply discussing Socrates as a character?
That's what always has been done. I mean, that is what we've done when we've talked about Socrates as a character. We have relied on what you call the semi-fictional tradition. That is the tradition that essentially is Plato and Xenophon, and to some degree Aristophanes, since Aristophanes uses Socrates as a central character in his comic play The Clouds. So it's not as if we're not already doing that. We're already relying on these semi-fictional, and clearly semi-fictional because they differ in their portrayals, they come from different angles. And we have to accept that that is what's been done. What I have done is I've said, look, there are these other bits of evidence which can create a different story. And you might say it's also semi-fictional, but I actually happen to think it's more true to the circumstances of Socrates' life as we know it within the history of ancient Athens. So
I think there's a benefit, even if it's so we can't know for sure, right? Unless, like Doctor Who, we have a time machine, and we will never know 100% sure. However, even if it turned out the real Socrates doesn't really correspond to the image, the attempt to try and reconstruct a coherent image of his life, I think, is beneficial anyway, because it gets us a bit closer, perhaps, to how subsequent generations may have perceived him. They for instance, there are many things like when in Plato's dialogues, Plato's audience would have received those texts in a manner and understood them and interpreted them in a way that's different from us today. Because just to give a very simple example, Plato alludes in passing to many events. He names many real historical individuals, which would mean little or nothing to modern readers, but meant a lot to his audience and would have added to the significance of the discussion and provided some context. So authors like yourself who are kind of trying to reconstruct the story, in a way, part of what you're inevitably doing is making the story more accessible, I think, by filling in some of the gaps to a modern audience.
That's what I hope to do, and also to try and treat Socrates as a real person, because the thing is that with some of these very exceptional characters, their exceptionality, think of Jesus or whatever, emerges in the course of the tradition that builds up around them. And in the case of Socrates, there are realities. The reality, for example, that he had a very young partner when he was in his 60s. There's a reality that emerges from the pages of Plato that he was highly sexed. There's a reality that he had 3 children. And we have to ask ourselves all these questions about all these details. If he's to be a real person and not just a secular saint who died for the truth, which is, how people want to read Socrates, because of later generations just saw all that as highly admirable. And so when Socrates says in Plato's Charmides, I felt aflame with lust at the sight of his bare chest, that hasn't generally been repeated by the sources on Socrates' life, because they don't want us to think that Socrates was randy at the sight of a young man. But that's what Plato tells us.
Well, so we get this kind of sanitized version of Socrates. And I wonder, in some ways, if Plato contributes to that, while at the same time... well, actually, that leads me to a question. You mentioned in passing, let me back up slightly, Plato putting words into the mouth of Socrates. So there's always academic controversies about the Platonic dialogues and things like this. But as you mentioned, the common perception is there are early, middle, and late dialogues, and that Plato gradually, over time, puts more and more of his own thought. So are we safe in saying, for instance, that Plato's theory of forms, that would be perhaps the most famous example of something that the majority of people believe didn't come from Socrates? Because Aristotle appears to mention in passing that the theory of forms was invented by Plato, in which case Socrates, if we take that literally, could never have said any of that stuff, right?
I think that's right. I think there's no reason not to believe Aristotle. He said Socrates was not interested in the forms. That is a Platonic creation. Aristotle tells us very clearly that Socrates was really only interested in 2 things. One was definitions,
Mm-hmm.
What is love? What is truth? What is beauty? What is courage? He was always asking that question.
Mm-hmm.
And the other was in the idea that we should move from the particular to the general, which obviously relates to that. You can give me a particular episode in which you explain that somebody was very brave, but that doesn't tell me what bravery is. So move from that particularity to a more general understanding of something in order to get closer to what Socrates thought would be the truth, something that isn't changing, something you can't say, well, it's brave in this case, but not brave in that case. I want to know what the truth is about bravery. Now, obviously, that leads to something like the forms, the unchanging thing that encapsulates bravery, truth, beauty, knowledge, and so on. But he didn't, well, as Aristotle says, he wasn't interested in that. He just wanted to get to that generality. And then in some ways, what Aristotle himself does is he almost goes back to what he considers to
Mm.
be Socrates' original idea.
Right.
He says, the forms don't exist in the way that Plato said they did. What we're talking about are universals, what you might say types rather than tokens, universals rather than particulars. So Aristotle goes back to what we consider a common sense view. This is a
Mm-hmm.
matter of logic, that there is such a thing as bravery, but it's not something that exists in some divine realm, as Plato tried to make it.
Well, to put it very simply, like Plato's philosophy is more mystical, more metaphysical, more otherworldly, and I guess that raises another question. There are so many curious oddities about this body of literature. One of them is that Socrates. I think what emerges from this is that Socrates, in many ways, is a kind of more worldly figure than Plato's theory of forms would imply. And an interesting question is given that Plato is one of our main sources for Socrates, the way that Plato portrays Socrates, to me, and this may be controversial, it seems quite at odds with the type of person that Plato himself was and the way that he taught philosophy. So, I'll give maybe a kind of trite example. Plato did not do philosophy in the Agora. And yet, all of his dialogues are about a guy that went around doing philosophy in the Agora. And so it seems like he's kind of portraying an idealized image of the philosopher, which doesn't really correspond to what, in some regards, Plato was doing, or even in some ways, the type of philosophy that he was interested in.
That's right. The portrayal of Socrates is of someone who is essentially a speaker, an interlocutor, an examiner, and a public one at that, and someone who leads his interlocutors to agree with him in certain ways, though not perhaps as insistently as some would have it. So very often, the early dialogues in particular end with disagreement, end with what they call aporia, uncertainty. And I think that that's something terribly important to recognize about the real Socrates, that he accepted that knowledge was provisional, that we were always on the path to knowledge, that we weren't going to get there and that we didn't get there, and that we needed to continue to examine these truths that we thought we had come up with to show that they weren't necessarily the final truth. So, as you said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So that's the picture that Plato draws of this man, certainly in the earlier dialogues. But he has a sort of early middle period dialogue, the Symposium, in which we get a very different picture of Socrates
Mm.
as a man of action. Socrates in the battle, Socrates
Yes.
as a lover, Socrates as someone who listened to the doctrine of a very clever woman and said that was the one thing he knew when he knew nothing else. So all that
Yeah.
is Plato's Symposium, a lovely dialogue and a hugely influential one. It's the question of what is love,
Yeah.
so a huge question for philosophers, and surprisingly, one that hasn't really been handled by philosophers ever
Yes.
since.
And the associated question of friendship, which was a huge topic in ancient philosophy, and is not a major subject in contemporary philosophy, which would puzzle. I think we'll come back to that stuff in a moment, but I actually want to interject another sense in which there's something puzzling about the image that we get of Socrates. So when I read Plato's dialogues as a student at university, my first degree was in philosophy. I said Plato and Aristotle, so I got a little bit of exposure early on to Greek philosophy. I kind of had this image of Socrates walking around, chatting to his friends, walking through pleasant groves in the Lyceum and Academy and by streams, lounging on couches at the symposium in the houses of wealthy men, occasionally maybe ruffling a sophist a little bit. But generally, it seems kind of quite a pleasant, urbane kind of life that he led. Then I read Thucydides, and I thought, oh my god, like Athens in the time of Socrates was a horrendous place to be. We were in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. Not only that, there's a tremendous poverty by the end of the war, huge amount of political turmoil. We get some indication of that from the Apology and so on, but also the plague. And so these things don't really come through. They're alluded to in Plato's dialogues, but there's something oddly missing about it. We get a kind of, in some regards, a kind of sanitized image of Socrates in relation to the historical and political environment that he lived. As you mentioned, he was a hoplite, and he served in some horrific battles. You know, we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, but it may even be Socrates probably knew people that were psychologically damaged by warfare, given some of the things that he'd been through.
Of course, yeah, yeah, and he would have known people who died. He would have known
Yeah,
people. It's funny, we don't get any indication anywhere that he ever killed anyone, even though he fought in
yeah,
dozens of battles. And it's possible that we aren't told this
yes.
explicitly. It's possible that he didn't kill anyone; that he deliberately kept his fighting to the point where he could retreat and wouldn't actually have to have the blood of another man, another Greek, on his hands. I don't know. Well, we're never told Socrates actually killed someone in a battle.
We're touching on many contradictions. Like, I mean, that's what's so much fun about this. But I'll mention one just in passing. You know, in the Apology, Socrates compares his presence in court to his military service and says that it's his duty, as in the military, to stand his ground. In the Laches, he defines courage, as you mentioned. It starts off with the definition of courage as standing your ground, and then he questions that and says it's not an adequate definition. However, when we look at his military service, he often had to retreat from battle, and he was involved in a number of routes, so he probably actually fled the battlefield. Like, along with all the other Athenians were running in disarray from battles. Socrates must have. We're told he's portrayed, and maybe this is important to Plato. Plato portrays him, goes out of his way to portray him retreating during a rout in a very orderly manner. But nevertheless, everyone around him was running for their lives in all different directions. Yeah, and yet here's a guy who goes on about how it's important to stand your ground as a virtue. So there are many contradictory threads, and it's quite challenging to imagine. Also, like you say, Socrates, on behalf of the Athenian assembly, was involved in arguably some quite unjust and horrific, like the siege of Potidæa ended, we're told, in cannibalism. And so, again, it's hard to imagine this guy discussing the nature of justice being involved in a campaign where civilians are reduced to such an abject condition. And so, Socrates, these real events don't really impinge that much on his discussions of justice.
Which is somewhat surprising. I mean, you mentioned Potidæa, so a 3-year campaign in which he served up in northern Greece. The Athenians were besieging the city of Potidæa, and in the end, the inhabitants starved. A lot of them starved to death and surrendered. And Socrates comes back in 429, so this is 432 to 429, and we're told at the beginning of Plato's Charmides that he's just come back from Potidæa. Does he talk about it? No, he doesn't. Does he say that the enemy were starving to death and some of them were eating their own parents in order to survive? No, we don't get any of that. And as you say, Thucydides fills in some of those gaps.
Mm.
Now, Plato may well have decided he's just not going to go there. He's not going to give us those kinds of circumstantial realities in order to move on to talk about the theme of the dialogue. But I think what we get is a little bit of those realities filtering through, and above all, filtering through in the symposium. But you mentioned the Laches, and we are, as well as the portrayal in the symposium of Socrates retreating in an orderly manner at the Battle of Delium, we get in the Laches, Socrates, in the mouth of Socrates, a piece of advice for a
Mm-hmm.
soldier who has to run away. And he says precisely that. When you're in retreat, it's much better not to run. So it matches up with the experience we're told that he actually
Yeah,
had in the symposium at Delium in 424.
this
But,
is
yeah, so I think there's a lot of this personal experience that Socrates spoke about and emerges in the dialogues as Plato records him.
this is where it gets fun. Is it's almost like solving a puzzle. Like it becomes very interesting. I mentioned earlier, like when I read your book, it felt as if you were writing a movie about Socrates, and it's like the greatest story never told kind of thing. It's an amazing story, but it's kind of requires a bit of scholarship and a little bit of interpretation and a little bit of speculation to get there. But I always felt like we're missing out on it today. It's a shame that people don't know and can't visualize the story of Socrates because he's one of the most remarkable men in history. And I really got that when I was reading your book, that there's a story waiting to burst out there, which, people would perhaps give people a way of getting into classics and into philosophy.
Yes, I
Um,
completely agree. And in fact, a young screenwriter in America has written a fabulous screenplay, which I hope one day will become a Hollywood movie. Now, I mean, these things require a producer to take them up and realize their potential. But the screenplay, interestingly, is set in uh, 447 BC, when Socrates would have been
mhm.
22. And that was a time when Socrates would have met, and we're coming to this now, would have met the young Aspasia of Miletus, who was this beautiful, clever woman who came
Yes.
to Athens perhaps 3 years earlier and would have known Socrates because she was part of Pericles' circle, as was Socrates.
Yep.
And he would have known her. And in 445, she was with Pericles. She married him, or she moved in with him, and then
Yeah.
was with him for another 16 years. But she was half Pericles' age. So we set the screenplay at a time when Socrates is just about
Right.
to go off to his first battle,
Uh-huh.
and he's met this woman. He's fallen in love with her. He returns from his battle,
Yeah.
and he finds that she has decided to go off with the leading citizen of Athens, Pericles. So
Yeah.
he is put in a position, and this is very much like Shakespeare in Love, where the
Uh-huh.
love of his life has gone off with someone else, and he has to decide what to do. Shakespeare became a playwright, Socrates becomes a philosopher.
That's a fantastic way of approaching it. And let's let's get kind of nerdy about it for a minute and dig into some of what's going on there. First of all, a bit of trivia for you. The last time I saw Aspasia or Aspasia was in the City Hall of Athens, because there is I went to the mayor's office for an event we were organising there, and there's a bust of her alongside Pericles in the Athenian City Hall. But most of our listeners will never have heard of, I mean, many of them won't have heard of Pericles, but very few of them will have heard of Aspasia. And yet she is kind of a female Socrates, and certainly one of the most, or is she a female sophist? Or a bit both. Like, certainly one of the most intriguing women in history. But just to broaden this question a little bit before we go into it deeper, it's often said that there are very few women in ancient philosophy. And Socrates certainly isn't a woman. However, strangely, everything about Socrates is paradoxical. Strangely, when we study his life, there are a number of quite intriguing women on the periphery that play quite important roles in shaping his philosophy. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yes, I think. Well, I think there is really just one, and that is Aspasia, because one could say, Xantippe. Some people have attempted to say because she was a difficult partner that she might have persuaded Socrates to sharpen up his argumentative technique. But the problem is Socrates met her when, she had a babe in arms when Socrates was dying, age 70. So how old was she then? 30? If so,
Mm-hmm.
he can't have met her more than about 10 years earlier when he was 60. So this is a man who's famous for being quite sexually vigorous. And yet
Mm-hmm.
his first experiences with a woman when he's 60, that just doesn't make any sense at all. And Aristotle,
Right.
luckily, tells us that, no, he had a wife much earlier than that. I think we can reconstruct it was much earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Gives us her name, he gives us her lineage. So and he tells us the first two sons of Socrates were from her. Plato,
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, suppresses that, just tells us he had
Yeah.
3 boys from Xantippe. Okay, so yes, Xantippe, I don't think had any influence at all on Socrates' thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But Aspasia, or Aspasia, as I call her, certainly will have done, in my view,
Mm-hmm.
because she is undoubtedly the model for the woman in the symposium that Plato
Whoa,
gives the name Diotima to.
this is great. How confident are you of that
Absolutely certain
assertion?
that there is a modeling going on. I'm not saying that Diotima, as presented
Yeah.
in the symposium, is Aspasia, but
Uh-huh.
Diotima is someone who is meant to make us think of Aspasia.
Yes,
And what
I
I
agree.
discovered were 2 reasons for thinking that. One is that the name given to
Mm-hmm.
this apparently fictional person points
Mm-hmm.
directly at Aspasia because the name means honored by Zeus. Zeus was the nickname given to Pericles by all the comic poets, so this would have been known by readers of Plato.
Yeah.
And famously, Plutarch tells us that Pericles honored Aspasia above all women and more than most Athenians honored their wives
Yeah.
because he embraced her in public. So, honored by Zeus could only have meant to many Athenian readers,
Yeah.
Pericles, Aspasia.
So we should back up a little bit and explain for the listeners. This Diotima is this character in Plato's Symposium who Socrates, again remarkably, describes a retrospectively describes a conversation with, where she teaches him about the art of love. She teaches him a kind of philosophy of love, and she, unusually for Plato, we're given a fairly specific date, or we're given a couple of clues that are fairly unambiguous about the dating of it. It's pretty early on in Socrates' life. And then one of the other challenging things about it, I don't know, I can't remember if you mentioned this or not in your book, but what she actually says to Socrates, according to him, is that she questions him using something that looks like the Socratic method, which raises the question, is he implying that he learned the Socratic method even from this woman? And then that raises another contradiction, because in the Apology, Plato has him says that he develops the Socratic method himself after the pronouncement from Delphi. So he gives us what, on the face of it, look like perhaps 2 conflicting accounts about where that method may have originated.
Well, I mean, the Socratic method that he says he employed after going to Delphi was finding people who thought they were clever and
Mm-hmm.
showing them that they didn't really know what they were talking about. So he would go to these senior politicians or wealthy businessmen and he'd say, tell me what courage or truth or knowledge is. And they would come up with a confident answer. And he'd say, but here's a counterexample. And they would then be lost. So he gets his answers or gets closer to the truth by questioning common assumptions and then saying, well, we don't know actually what these things are, but we can get closer to them by
Mm-hmm.
stripping away untruth. So that's the sort of negative method that he calls his dialectic, his conversational method. Now, we get a bit of that from Zelton, but actually we don't really get the method because she tells him, this is what love is. Here's my doctrine. And in some ways, that goes against what Socrates goes on to say in his philosophy, because he says you cannot simply tell somebody this is how things are. You have to
Mm-hmm.
always have to question. And so some scholars have actually said Diotima is not particularly Socratic in the way she presents that. She presents a doctrine of love.
Mm-hmm.
However, Socrates says in the Symposium, this is the truth about love. And if he says that, it means he knows that what she says is correct. And that is unusual because Socrates generally doesn't say, I know the truth. He says, we're trying to get to the truth and we may never get there. In this
Mm-hmm.
case, he says, well, I know the truth about love because I was taught it by a clever woman called Diotima.
Mm-hmm.
And he gives us this date that you mentioned, 10 years before the plague. She
Mm-hmm.
had, that was in 440 BC. That was when Aspasia would have been ensconced with Pericles, and every reason to think that she did the thing that Socrates says was done at that time. Socrates said, anyway, I listened to this clever woman, who he calls Diotima, on more than one occasion, talking about love, and this is what she said. And so that is why I know what love is.
And he was in his late 20s, I
Well,
think,
he
if
doesn't say that. He says,
approximately.
I heard her, some time ago, giving this doctrine, and if indeed we're talking about the 440s, then yes, he would have been in his 20s.
And, well, let me think. So, Aspasia, let's try and flesh out the image of her a little bit. How would you relate her? How would we compare her, for example, to the sophists?
Well, interestingly, in the Symposium, Socrates describes how she gives the doctrine, and he says, just like an accomplished sophist. So he effectively calls her a sophist. She gives her doctrine like an accomplished sophist. Now, Socrates didn't want to be thought of as a sophist. Plato certainly doesn't want him to be thought of, because the sophists pretended to an expertise which Socrates didn't
Mm-hmm.
believe they could have. They said, these are the answers. You want to know how to fight? This is how to do it. You want to know how to think about grammar or about life? They had all the answers. That's what a sophist was. An expert is what one translation of the word sophist in Greek. Someone who has sophia, wisdom. Socrates said, no, I'm not a sophist. I'm not an expert. I'm a seeker after sophia, a seeker after wisdom. And that seeking is a love of wisdom. A lover is someone who pursues. I'm a philosophos, a pursuer of wisdom. I'm a philosopher. So he made that distinction. Plato wanted to insist on that distinction. The average Athenian had no interest in that distinction. They called
Yeah.
Socrates sophist.
Yes.
Famously, years later, Aeschines in his speech says, you put Socrates the sophist to death.
Yeah.
Not even thinking that Socrates would have said, well, just a moment. I never claimed to be a sophist. I never claimed to be an expert. I only claimed to be a seeker of after knowledge. So, yes, Diotima, unlike Socrates, is presented as an expert, someone who knows the answer. So, in that sense, is different from the way Socrates presents himself. He actually buys it, or appears to. He says, this is the answer. This is the doctrine that she taught me, and it's the right one. So,
Yep.
he's doing that. Now, she's not using dialectic on him, really. I mean, she's used a little bit of question and answer, but essentially she gives him the doctrine. But she
Mm-hmm.
also does two other things. One is she insists on a definition, and she gets to a definition. She tells him
Yeah.
in the end what love is. And the second thing is she tells us that part of her doctrine, anyway, is that love proceeds from particular objects of love to a much more general view of what
Mm-hmm.
love is. And it goes up a ladder, she says. Now, those are the two very things that
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle tells us were what Socrates was interested in,
Yeah.
definition and moving into a particular. So she's certainly, if it's correct that
Uh-huh.
Socrates learned his philosophy from her, he might have learned something about dialectic, but I suspect, as you say, he learned that from trying to question what the Delphic oracle meant by saying he was the cleverest of men. But he certainly did learn other things, which was the
Yeah.
notion of definition is important, and moving from the particular to the general is important.
So she was an expert on the art of love. She appears to have some kind of wisdom, but she also, in that discussion, in a sense, defines what it means to be a philosopher, and she defines it in a sense negatively as somebody um, who lacks wisdom but loves wisdom. So
Mm.
again, there's a kind of tension there between the fact that she seems to have wisdom, but the way that she portrays what it means to be a philosopher. And she also, in another Platonic dialogue, we're told that she wrote speeches,
Mm,
like a sophist or a rhetorician.
yeah.
Although, correct me if I'm wrong, but historically, are there any examples of women delivering speeches in public in Athens?
Not at this time. Certainly not at this period.
So this is quite odd behavior, and perhaps, and like maybe she was giving
No, it
you.
certainly doesn't say she ever delivered a speech. It just says that
She wrote,
she wrote the speech which Pericles delivered.
yes,
She wrote the funeral speech. And people have laughed at this. But it's in a dialogue called the Menexenus by Plato,
yeah,
in which he says, I went to Aspasia and asked her how to do a funeral speech. And she said, I'll teach you the one that I once taught Pericles. So we imagine the great funeral speech that he gives in 430 BC, as reported by Thucydides.
well,
And so they are together, and he's learning and repeating some of these elements of the speech. And he said, and when I got it wrong, she nearly slapped me.
yeah,
So they're in a position of close familiarity.
yeah,
And this is
and
when older, I have to say. So this is set in
yes,
late fifth century, when
right.
he's in his 60s, and so she would have been as well.
I mean, I think part of what the picture that you're painting as well is that Socrates had more access to the circle of Pericles than people might normally assume.
That's hugely important, and it's obvious as well, given that he was the tutor and the best friend, and in fact, the deepest lover of Alcibiades when Alcibiades was in his late
Yeah.
teens, and they shared a tent together in Potidaea. Socrates was in his 30s, and Alcibiades
Yep.
was Pericles' ward, Pericles'
Also,
guardian from the age of 5 when his father died. So,
Xenophon tells us that Socrates is friends with Pericles Junior.
and he was friends with Pericles the Younger, who was the daughter of, sorry, who was the son of
Son of a, yeah,
Pericles and Aspasia, and who was executed in 406 BC because he was one of the
yeah,
generals who fought in the Battle of Arginusae and failed to pick up the dead. And the Athenians put them all on trial en masse. And amazingly, what a coincidence, Socrates came out of self imposed uh, abstinence from political life for the only time we ever hear him doing so, in
mhm,
order to try and defend those generals against the charge of mass slaughter. And why did he do that? There can only be one answer, and that was that somebody asked him, presumably Aspasia, to
right,
help to try and save her son Pericles Jr. And as you say in Xenophon's Memorabilia, we have a dialogue between, friendly dialogue between Socrates and Pericles Jr. About, suggesting that the two of them were on familiar terms.
Also, we have a pseudo-Platonic dialogue. Now we're getting real deep cuts called the Axiochus, where Socrates seems to be on friendly terms with another member of their family, who is, if I remember rightly, Alcibiades' best friend and uncle.
Yeah,
Like, so Socrates seems to be is portrayed as being quite entangled with this whole extended family.
exactly. And that just must tell us a lot about his background. He was not from some poor, indigent stonemason's family. If his father, we're told, was a stone worker, but there's no reason to think he was some poor lone artisan, as many have decided he must have been. He could easily have been a stone worker who employed perhaps dozens of slaves in a
Yeah,
large factory producing reliefs and statues at a time when Athens was commissioning these at a huge rate for all the new building works that Pericles had instigated on the Acropolis. So let's not assume anything about his background that we aren't able to verify. And what we can say is he was a hoplite soldier that needed a wealth
yes,
level to be proved,
yep,
and he was in the circle of Pericles, which he wouldn't have been if he'd been some poor indigent artisan. He was clearly from the upper classes, or at least not from the lowest class.
yeah, yeah. And actually, we should, for the sake of the listeners, do you want to just kind of fill in people that might not be as familiar with the history and say a little bit about who Pericles was.
So Pericles was the leading statesman and politician of the 5th century BC, from around 460 BC. This has been when Socrates was only about 10. Pericles was already a leading political figure, and he was a populist. So although he himself came from an extremely aristocratic background, and he was part of a clan called the Alcmaeonids, which had produced important leaders and politicians from Athens in recent and not so recent history, but recently, for example, Miltiades, the general who was the victor at the Battle of Marathon, he came from that clan. There seems to be evidence that Axiochus, who you mention, was also an Alcmaeonid, and that Alcibiades certainly was, we know. This was the young man who Socrates loved and looked after, and who was Pericles' ward. So these Alcmaeonids, this very important clan, very important in Athens, produced Pericles, who then became the leading citizen of Athenian democracy, voted general time and time again, and someone whose career continued to make him the top man in Athens until his death in 429. So a 30-year span of political power and influence, and in the course of that, attracting some very important thinkers, including a man called Anaxagoras, who had a colleague or pupil called Archelaus, who we are told was Socrates' older lover when Socrates was a teenager. So Archelaus, Alcibiades, and then Aspasia herself, related, the daughter of a man called Axiochus, so related to these important elite influential clans, including Pericles himself. All of that gives us a picture that most of us don't associate with Socrates.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I'm going to, in the spirit of fun and just kind of speculating a bit about things, there's something else I wanted to ask you about. I mentioned earlier about the role of different women.
Who are you
That come up,
thinking?
a bunch of them, like the Pythia, Theodota, but also Phenarete, his mum. So Socrates famously says that he abandoned his father's profession as a stonemason in order, figuratively, to follow in his mother's profession as a midwife. Although his mother was, I think, maybe this is a slightly misleading translation, perhaps. Maybe you can correct me here. But I think his mother in ancient Greece would have not merely been what we think of as a midwife, but the role that she's alluding to is slightly broader than that. She would have been an older, wiser woman that other younger women went to for various pieces of life advice, including incantations, rituals, potions. He mentions childbirth, but also he says matchmaking. Interestingly, which is something he refers to many times, and he also, in Xenophon's Memorabilia, says that Aspasia is an expert on matchmaking. Socrates clearly thinks of himself as a matchmaker, in a sense, figuratively, or however you want to take it. So I wonder, and this would be wild, kind of just speculating, if Socrates' mother actually was an expert on matchmaking, and if Aspasia taught matchmaking, is it possible that these two women had ever met? But certainly, if his mother was genuinely had a professional interest in this, you'd think at the very least she would be interested in what Aspasia had to say about it.
Well, you see, I would have thought that it's completely far-fetched to suggest that his mother was a professional midwife.
Right.
So I think that, he brings that up in the dialogue called Theaetetus, and it's clearly meant to lead to this figurative notion that he, as a philosopher, is bringing to birth ideas in the people he meets and philosophizes with. So then he says, of course, my mother was a midwife. What does that mean? Well, she, as you say, she was an advisor. She was an older, wiser woman. She was the kind of person who people came to for advice on things like, as you say, falling in love and getting matched. And no reason to suggest any of that was a professional activity, let alone the activity of being a midwife. So I don't think we should assume that any more than we should assume that his father was some poor lone artisan.
Well, do you think it's something that she was known for?
Yeah,
Like, perhaps
well,
to
that's what
rephrase
I
it like
think she
that.
was known for. She was known as a woman, perhaps the wife of someone really quite highly placed in his village, because we know that her husband, Socrates' father, Sophroniscus, was best friends with Lysimachus, who
Mhm.
himself was the son of a very aristocratic man called Aristides. So there's an aristocratic circle there, or an elite
Mhm.
circle, and I think she, with her name, Finarite, the mother, which suggests shining virtue, it is almost an aristocratic name in itself, would have been known for the kind of activities that highly placed elite women did.
Mhm.
And Aspasia, similarly, as you say, was interested in all that stuff. She was supposed to have held a salon advising Athenian men on what a good marriage should be like. There's a snippet of that in Cicero,
Mhm.
where he is quoting from a book which unfortunately is lost, which was a biography of Aspasia
Mhm.
by a pupil of Socrates called Aeschines. And in that, Aeschines describes, and Cicero quotes, how Aspasia would welcome to her home, or presumably her father's home, or Pericles' home, couples who wanted to learn how to be successful in their
Mhm.
marriages. And so she gave advice on that, and she was known as a matchmaker. She was known as a clever woman who could teach people the art of eloquence, as she taught Socrates,
Yes.
all of these things. So I agree with you that there seems to be a strong
I'll
influence.
mention another parallel, actually, from the slender evidence that we have about finarity. Socrates also mentions in the Theaetetus that she doesn't normally advertise, or women of her kind don't normally advertise the fact that they do matchmaking because they don't want to be accused of being a procuress,
Indeed.
which is something that Aspasia was accused of being, if I remember rightly. So
Well,
I just mentioned that as another kind of parallel.
that's very interesting, actually. Yes, thank you. Of course, it's true that Aspasia was accused of all sorts of terrible things, and people have taken them seriously. You know, she was accused by the comic poets. So there is
Yeah.
not a single sniff of, no, it's not a single whiff of accusation in Plato or Xenophon that she was
Mhm.
anything but a respected woman, a very clever woman, someone who Socrates could say, I can send my friends to you for advice on how to run a household, someone who taught in Plato, taught Pericles and Socrates how to give a speech. All of that is what we learn from the serious biographers and philosophers. What we learn from the comic playwright is that she was a prostitute, she ran a brothel, that she made Pericles go to war because some of her
Mhm.
whores had been stolen.
Yeah.
We can't take any of what the comic playwrights tell us seriously, and yet people have done so amazingly, and they haven't taken what Plato and Xenophon tell us
She's
seriously.
classicist in a job.
Yeah, exactly
It's
that. But
in a sense.
it's an absurdity. You know, if you're going to take someone seriously, it's not a comic poet.
Yes, I think that's fair. Although, I mean, it's one of the. What can we take from Aristophanes? At the same time, we
Aristophanes doesn't tell us that. He,
no. I'm thinking about. Okay, I'm coming back to this earlier question, I suppose, which is still in my mind of what do we know about Socrates himself
okay.
and the clouds being, but let's say the satirists in general.
Hmm.
Um, you know, so we can't take them seriously, but at the same time, they provide us with some sort of evidence an annoyingly indirect way.
Yeah, that's true. So sorry. Yes, I mean Aristophanes does say that it's because of the prostitutes who were stolen by the Megarians that Pericles started the Peloponnesian War.
Mhm.
So he does, he does join in, but this is after Pericles is
Right.
dead. In fact, he
Yeah.
does join in the slander that the other comic poets were happy to level at Aspasia.
Well, let's get to come back. If we broaden our perspective, say we look at the clouds, there's a
Mm.
lot of detail in there which seems completely different from the way that Socrates and Plato and Xenophon portray Socrates. However, if we start with at the very minimal level, what I suppose we can take from Aristophanes is the fact that Socrates must have been pretty famous,
Yes,
presumably. So he provides evidence of that at the bare minimum.
yes.
Uh,
He would have been well known to be the butt of a whole comic play in that way. Well known within Athens. So there's a story that Aelian tells us
yeah.
that the foreigners who came to the great Dionysia where this was put on were asking, "Who is this guy, Socrates?" And Socrates stood up. I say it's like his Spartacus moment. Stood up so that they could see that the man on stage was supposed to be modelled on him.
Mm-hmm.
Great story. I mean, possibly made up, but the idea that Socrates went to see this play in which he was portrayed and then felt a need to explain to people that there is a real person who's being made fun of.
I believe you could still go there, and the Theatre of Dionysus would be where that on the slopes of the Acropolis.
That's right.
You
Yes,
could potentially sit where Socrates was allegedly sitting if you wanted to go on a trip
that
there.
depends whether you believe that
If you believe the story.
you believe that the marble theatre of Dionysus existed at that time. A lot of scholars do not. They think
Right,
it
I
was
see.
built later, and that at this stage the theatre might have been in that spot, but it would have just
Right.
consisted of wooden
Yes,
chairs piled up.
that would make sense. That makes sense. Now, we could talk all day, but I wonder, do you have time for a few more questions?
Yeah, sure.
I've got a couple lined up. Okay. So, first of all, like, why on earth did Socrates become so fixated on Alcibiades? What did he see in this guy, to put it colloquially? So, the image that we get, for example, from historical sources is of a reckless, arrogant figure. It's to some extent accused of being a traitor, unpredictable. Like, why was Socrates so strongly associated and so attached to Alcibiades? What was the nature of their relationship?
Well, that's a big question, but he was clearly smitten by him. And as far as we can tell, Socrates would have met him, or at least would have known him, when he was a young boy. So there's some evidence from that in Plato's dialogues where Socrates says
Right.
he was playing with other boys. He was playing chicken, you jump, and also playing with the dice equivalent to Stragolos. And when he found another boy cheating, he was furious and said, "You dirty cheat." Anyway, so one imagines that Socrates was already in Pericles' circle, and when Pericles takes over the guardianship of Alcibiades after Alcibiades' father, who's related to Pericles, dies in battle at the age of 5, Socrates is already on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And at some stage, he becomes his mentor and his tutor. And I make the point in the book that this must have been with the approval of Pericles. So then, as this boy grows up, and we're told he was the most beautiful young man in Athens, so he must have been physically extraordinary and lovely. And he was also
a celebrity. I think it'd be a good way of putting it.
We're thinking about him as 13, 14. He was a scallywag at that point. So there's
if we've got at that age, but he would go on to become a huge, and then he must have been an incredibly charismatic figure.
Very charismatic, but he shares a tent with Socrates, and his life is saved already when he's 19. So we're talking about this young man. Socrates fights with him. They fight in campaigns together, but they wrestle together. They talk together. They think together. He teaches him. Alcibiades says in the Symposium, he's the one person in whose company I didn't stray. Now, of course, at that stage, Alcibiades has become a traitor to Athens. So he goes on to become a populist leader, one who you could find many perhaps parallels with leaders who people think, there's someone from the upper classes, but he's someone we can trust and we like. And recently in Britain, of course, that happened with Boris Johnson, amazingly. Not necessarily the most beautiful man, but Alcibiades did have beauty as well as that kind of charisma. And then he's accused of doing some terrible sacrilege, just before the expedition to Sicily, and is exiled. And the only way he thinks he can recoup his life is to go to the other side and help the Spartans. And he does that for a bit, and he then returns to Athens. He manages to win back the popularity that he'd lost, for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then things go sour again, and just as he runs off into exile, he is he is executed probably by a combination of Sparta and Persia. So it's a very exciting life. It's one which I'm sure he wouldn't have chosen to be thought of as a traitor. He would have loved to be an Athenian hero,
Mm-hmm.
but having been exiled by Athens for his sacrilege, he becomes a traitor.
Mm-hmm.
I think what happened to Socrates is that having brought up this young man and loved him, as he said, more than he loved any other man, he probably would have been dismayed when Alcibiades went over to the other side. But I think up until that point, he would have had a grudging admiration for the way Alcibiades was such a popular, such a beloved figure. He was
Mm-hmm.
kind of everything that Socrates wasn't in that respect. He
Mm-hmm.
was someone who was very much into the life of politics and very successful, hugely persuasive,
Yeah.
hugely charismatic. Socrates said that his inner voice prevented him from
Yeah.
being a politician. So I think
Well, do you think they were opposites in some regards? Maybe it's worth saying. Yeah.
on one hand, he was his alter ego. He was someone Socrates would have wanted to be, a dashing, brilliant, clever, controversial soldier. On
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, he was exactly the opposite. He was
Mm-hmm.
someone who involved himself in political life, got out there and persuaded people about things that Socrates no doubt would have had a million doubts. So he was both. He was the
What did
yin
they
and
have?
yang.
What did they have in common?
I think they had aristocratic and elite aspirations, which means being good
Mm-hmm.
fighters and good speakers. They both wanted to be those things. They both
Mm-hmm.
were those things. I think they probably had some political notions in common, in the sense that Socrates is presented by Plato as an arch democrat, but that's clearly because the
Mm-hmm.
Athenian democracy required him to be that, at the time when he was accused of helping the aristocrats who wanted to subvert democracy. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think in reality, Socrates, we know, was quite scathing about the way the Democrats were simply led by the nose, that the demos of Athens were
Mm-hmm.
led to do all sorts of things that were really detrimental to the state. And although he fought for Athens because it was his city state, he didn't approve, I think, of a lot of the things that democracy got up to, which were clearly, dubious in the extreme anyway. And they did it for pretty bad reasons. They did it for
Mm-hmm.
to become colonialists and to become uh,
Right.
wealthy on the back of the subjects of the Athenian Empire.
Well,
So
maybe we should just flesh that out a little bit. The Athenians did some horrific things, like war
there's some
crimes. Yeah.
horrendous things in Mytilene, in Milos, and so on in the course of the Peloponnesian War. And they did so because the assembly voted for them, and the assembly voted for these things because populist politicians like Cleon and others argued that this is what the assembly should do. So Socrates and Plato could clearly see the shortfalls of the democratic system. It allowed the people as a whole to do things, to be swayed to do things that were simply wrong. And executing all the generals en masse in 406 would have been another
Mm-hmm.
of those decisions, which Socrates would have thought this is the problem with democracy. They vote with their emotions. They're not thinking about what is right, and whether these people should all be executed en masse. So Socrates himself was no doubt a critic of democracy. It doesn't mean he was a tyrant or an oligarch. He probably did agree that people should be educated to be the
Mm-hmm.
leaders of the state. So the
Mm-hmm.
idea that everyone from top to bottom could have a vote, I think, would not have been Socrates'
Mm-hmm.
ideal political stance.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those things he would have had in common with Alcibiades.
Right. Well, let me ask another question. So you mentioned the fact that I guess we have to assume that some of the listeners won't know some of these stories. So, for example, one of the anecdotes is about Socrates saving the life of Alcibiades at Potidaea and kind of earning a decoration for valor, which he was passed over for, and it was awarded to Alcibiades instead. But also in the retreat from Delium, it's kind of implied that Alcibiades protected Socrates. And in a sense, perhaps it could even be said that Alcibiades saved Socrates' life, or at least helped to protect him during the retreat from that battle. So that both of those incidents really contribute to this picture of there being a tremendous bond, apart from the fact that they're in love with each other. And Alcibiades has known Socrates for since his youth, and their family. Socrates knows his family. They saved each other's life. They, as well, serving in battle. They must have been tremendously close following those events. But to come back to the experience of warfare, I remember that you'd mentioned Socrates' voice or sign. Did Socrates have mental illness? Would be an interesting question. Does it relate to perhaps his experiences during the war and so on? How is the voice an auditory hallucination?
Yeah, I mean, we would call it that. I mean, unless you actually want to believe that he had a voice that was, as it were, divinely inspired, we would say he had an auditory hallucination. He tells us he had it from early youth, so it's not something that came about because of his fighting experiences. He had it as a young boy. I actually associate it with a comment that he makes in one of Plato's dialogues, Protagoras, about how truants are beaten by their fathers.
Yeah.
I associate it with that simply because if he had been beaten by his father because he played truant, and there's no evidence for that, but except that he says that's what happens when boys play truant, then it's possible that that would have left a scar on him, because he might have felt guilty that he wasn't doing what his father wanted him to do, which presumably was go into the family business and become a stonemason. And he wanted to go off into the city and listen to people speaking about philosophical things or about educational matters. And he was then picked up by this older man, Archelaus, and who and then they became lovers. Who knows what brought about this auditory hallucination? It wasn't of enormous import in his life. He said, for example, it stopped him from walking forward when he could have been run over by a cart on one occasion. So it could have, he said, it prevented me from doing things that were potentially dangerous. The more important than that was perhaps the fact he said it stopped me from going into political life, because it warned me that if I did that, I would become much hated.
I'm going to challenge that view, and I said perhaps, like a little bit, a tiny bit, because if I remember correctly, I'm stretching my memory a little bit here. I think in the first Alcibiades, Plato refers to the voice and says that Socrates withheld from approaching Alcibiades until his voice ceased to deter him from doing it. So if that's true, it would have defined the nature of his relationship with Alcibiades, if we can take that at face value.
Maybe then it is more important even than we would than I have suggested. But yes, something perhaps did stop him from getting too close to Alcibiades too soon. Who knows? I mean, actually, if the picture of this young boy becoming his tutee or mentee at a very young age is true, then you can't imagine how Alcibiades, aged 19, would have said, "Sleep with me," which is what we're told he did in the Symposium. He couldn't imagine why Socrates was resisting him, because he said, "I was a very beautiful young man. How come he resisted me?" Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know. A lot of ancient sources say, of course, Socrates and Alcibiades were actually lovers. But Plato wants to paint this picture of them so that he shows Socrates as this much more high-minded man, only interested in Alcibiades' soul, in order to save Socrates from the kind of suspicion that he corrupted young men. That was one of the charges on which he was executed, and it presumably implied a sexual liaison, this corruption. The word in Greek, diaphtero, does imply sexual corruption, but also political. So, I mean, whatever the truth of the matter, anyway, he did eventually become a lover, either platonic or otherwise, and of course, platonic comes from the Symposium. of Alcibiades, and
But
would have supported him.
something else that I wanted to ask you, but this is quite a specific question. It's just something
Mm.
that's always irked me about Plato's Apology. So there's a passage in Plato's Apology where he says that after the pronouncement made by the Pythia at Delphi, the oracle, that no man was wiser than Socrates, he says that he immediately went to Athens um, and sought out a statesman
Yes.
that was renowned for his wisdom, but he doesn't name him. And then he says this man became angry and irritated with him, and so did a number of his associates. And he implies that that kind of the animosity that was generated pursued him, and then obviously he started to challenge other people. Who was that statesman?
Could only have been one person, couldn't it?
Well, do you think it was Pericles?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wonder. I wonder. I've got another candidate,
Go on.
but maybe a more controversial one.
Mm.
Okay. All right. This is controversial, but not too far removed from Pericles. I wonder if it's possible that he could be referring to Protagoras, who acted as an envoy on Pericles. He was a metic, so he wasn't an Athenian citizen. But I wonder if he could be describing Protagoras as an ambassador and a lawgiver as being a statesman, because Plato does imply that Socrates made a point of seeking out Protagoras, and he seems like the obvious candidate. If you wanted to find out whether Pericles would be a good candidate, Protagoras would be another obvious candidate for the guy that'd be top of your list. If you were Socrates and you were serious about finding out whether there was anyone that genuinely, because he was known as the wisest man alive. So,
yes, in the dialogue, Protagoras, of course, Socrates really treats him with tremendous respect, and in that sense, the dialogue as we get it from Plato doesn't suggest that Protagoras got pissed off with him in any way, or vice versa. Whereas I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Pericles did get pissed off with Socrates.
I was going to ask you about their relationship. There
Yeah.
is some kind of, I think there's some conflicting evidence about it. It's sometimes in the Platonic dialogues, Pericles is portrayed in a very positive light, sometimes in a more critical light.
Yes, I mean, I think he's presented quite critically. In fact, Socrates keeps his distance in the Platonic dialogues. That's what I think, because Plato doesn't want to go into this kind of detail. Now, maybe if Plato was telling us the truth, he'd have said, "Look, Pericles, first of all, took Aspasia when she had been Socrates' lover. Secondly, Aspasia was writing these speeches for Pericles in which she had said, because she had got pissed off with Socrates for not taking part in civic life.
Right.
One of the things Pericles says is, a person who doesn't take part in civic life is not just a private citizen, he's useless. Now, who's he talking about? There is one obvious character who should take part in civic life but doesn't, and that is Aspasia's former lover, Socrates, and so on and so forth. The Alcibiades thing, why is this man who's supposed to be teaching my ward, Alcibiades, allowing him to be so off the wall in his behavior? It seems to me that there were all sorts of reasons why Pericles could have had a certain froideur in relation to Socrates.
Actually, what would confirm what you've said also is in Xenophon's Memorabilia, there's this weird little mini dialogue where he portrays Alcibiades, if I remember rightly, approaching Pericles and kind of humiliating him in a way. Actually, he makes quite a snarky remark to him.
Very snarky, yes. He says, "Yeah, if I were a young man, I wouldn't act like you," or something. And he says, "Well, you're an old man, I wouldn't act like you." Whatever it is, he's quite rude to Pericles.
He says something like it back in, when I was at the height of my powers intellectual or something. And he says, "Oh, I wish I'd met you then."
Yes.
If I remember, something along those lines.
Yes.
So Xenophon portrays this kind of friction that seems to be as a result of Alcibiades being, I mean, certainly Pericles would have come away from that thinking Socrates is corrupting the youth.
Yes.
He's made my words act like a real jerk.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be worth pulling all this together and writing a piece about the relationship between Pericles and Alcibiades, because I think you got a point, or between Pericles and Socrates.
So maybe it's time to wrap up, and I
Yeah.
guess the conventional place to do that would be I'll ask you very briefly the big question, the cliche question in a way about Socrates. Why was Socrates forced to drink hemlock?
Well, we're told that, of course, he could have avoided the death penalty, but that he chose to follow, he said, the laws of Athens. Xenophon actually hints that Socrates knew that he was ill anyway, and that he was prepared to die a noble death.
He was 71-ish.
Mm. And perhaps not in the best of shape at that point. There are all sorts of suggestions you could make as to why he went along with it. A classicist has suggested that he wanted to die a death that would make him famous. Being aware that if he just simply died of old age, no one was going to pay any attention to all his work. All of that could be true. But I mean, the simple reason as to why he was put to death by the Athenians is that they were persuaded that he was a danger to their democratic system. And they were not pleased by the fact that he seemed to be rather flippant in his defense speech about what to them still seemed to be serious charges. Because only a few years previously, there had been some terrible battles between the Democrats and the oligarchs, and hundreds of Athenian citizens had died. And he
Yeah.
was seen to be the man who had at least encouraged this kind of oligarchic activity that had led to the overthrow of democracy on a couple of occasions.
It
So,
was one of his students who
yeah,
led the.
Critias was the head of the 30 Tyrants, and he was one of
Yeah.
Socrates' close students and associates. Alcibiades had done the same and possibly helped to bring about Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War. So this is what they believed. And if he had stood up and said, look, I actually was trying my best to help the Athenian democracy, which I believe in, that would have been perhaps something that would have allowed them. And this was a serious trial, by the way. People forget this. 500 jurors had to be assembled. This was
Yeah.
not just some poor old tramp who they picked off the street. This was an important political trial.
Yeah.
You don't get 500 people together for any old person. They thought that he was a serious threat to Athenian democracy, and they decided by a majority that he was not defending himself in a way that they felt was plausible, and so they put him to death.
Well, I think hopefully the discussion that we've had today will inspire some people to go away and learn more about Socrates, drink some hemlock. Like, we go away and learn something about Socrates because he really is one of the most remarkable. In my view, I'll be bold enough to say it, he's the most remarkable, enigmatic, multifaceted figure in the history of philosophy, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I think that really comes through in your book about him. So, Socrates and Love, again, I would encourage everyone to go out and read your book if they're at all interested in the subject. It's one of the most unique books and interesting books on the subject that I've read. So I strongly recommend that. So, well, that's been another great discussion, I think, today. So thanks to today's guest for joining me. And we hope that all of you listeners enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. So please share the link with your friends and subscribe to Stoicism, Philosophy as a Way of Life, the newsletter on Substack, for more podcasts and articles on philosophy. Thanks for listening. And it's goodbye from me, Donald Robertson, and from my guest, Armand D'Angour. Bye,
Goodbye.
everyone.